Hello and welcome to EESC 418A. This is Lecture 5B and we'll be talking about ways that we can make our writing more concrete, specific, and precise. So first let's look at each of those three terms and their antonyms. If we're looking for concrete language, concrete refers to something that we can perceive with our senses. So the actual definition is naming an object as opposed to a quality or an attribute. And that is in contrast to something that is abstract, meaning it's considered apart from perception or any concrete object, idealized or theoretical. And that refers to qualities, concepts, and ideas. And I'll give an example of each of these. So for example, an abstract idea is money. Money is an abstract concept. If I tell you I have money in my hand, you don't really know what I have in my hand. But if I tell you that I have a Canadian $10 bill in my hand, the Canadian $10 bill is the concrete example of the abstract idea, which is money. Similarly, we can have words that are precise versus vague. Precise means accurate in every detail or exact. In contrast, vague means not firmly determined, not clearly perceived, or hazy. And again, I'll use some examples here. So a vague example is potentially adverse impacts to fish habitat. That can mean a lot of things. However, a precise example of that vague example is sedimentation of fine particles over 32 square meters of spawning gravel. Here we have a pretty good idea of what that potentially adverse impact is. And finally, specific. Clearly distinguished, stated, or understood, as opposed to general, concerned with main features and not the details. For example, a general example here is a temperature sensor. A specific example is the Hoskin Hobo 2X external temperature data logger. In the general example, I have no idea what that sensor is. In the specific example, I know exactly what that instrument is. I can look up its specifications and I can use it in a replicable study. So let's look at how we would use these and how we would correct for abstract, vague, and general terms. Abstract and general terms can be used in technical writing, provided that they are just introducing more specific text to come. So if you think back to most of our topic sentences, they will start with generalities and then move into specifics. And that applies both to a topic sentence within a paragraph and the introduction to a larger document. But again, we always need to follow up with specifics, and we need to do so very quickly after introducing our generalities. Otherwise, we leave questions in the reader's mind. So here's an example. We used several instruments to sample the full suite of parameters at each water body. We used a Mettler X32 dissolved oxygen probe to measure DO, a Hoskin 45DR pH probe to measure pH, and a YSI XR multi-parameter sonde to measure conductivity and turbidity at 1 meter intervals. So I've just used these little boxes to highlight some of the terms I introduced on the previous slide. So several instruments, that's very vague. Somebody would look at that and go, which instruments? Several parameters or a suite of parameters, that's an abstract term. In the following sentence, I correct for that. I've introduced this fairly vague and abstract concept, and then we move into the specifics. So the concrete example is the probe. You can hold the probe in your hand. That's something you can perceive or hold. And the specific example is the model of the probe. Another example. The field technicians sampled media from several contaminated sites each day. They measured soil density, composition, and hydrocarbon content at each site. They gathered samples from 25 boreholes at the northwest corner of Harvey Avenue and Gordon Drive as shown in Figure 1. So here we have it again. They've sampled some media. That's sort of an abstract term. We don't really know what type of media. And several contaminated sites. That's very vague. We have no idea which sites those are or what they're contaminated with. In the following sentence, we move into specifics. So we give some concrete examples of what was sampled, which can also tell us what the site might be contaminated with. And finally, we move into specifics. In this case, we're actually leaving the specifics to Figure 1, although we do get a little bit more specific in the text. So 25 boreholes at the northwest corner of Harvey and Gordon. That's fairly specific. If you want to be completely specific now, you can go look at Figure 1 and you'll see the precise or specific locations of each sample location. So let's look at a few more examples And in this case, rather than having a topic sentence and a more specific sentence to follow, now we're just going to correct the sentences shown on the left to be more specific as shown on the right. Because the weather was unsuitable for our equipment, the fieldwork had to be cancelled. We can correct that by saying, because the freezing rain was damaging our spectrophotometer, the fieldwork was cancelled. Next, we observed many species of fish on the survey. This is fairly easily corrected. Anytime we're using several, many, or that type of qualifier, we should be thinking to ourselves, that's not very specific. In a technical document, I need to be specific and just list what those many things are. So in this case, we can just list the fish. We observed jackfish, northern pike minnow, rainbow trout, perch, and largemouth bass on the survey. Next, water concentrations exceeded guidelines by a large margin. This has a few different parts to it that are vague. So now we'll list the guideline and the exact concentration. And to be very specific, we'll list both the concentration of the water and the guideline that it exceeded. Water concentrations of mercury were 0.5 milligrams per liter, which exceeded the British Columbia Aquatic Life Guideline of 0.005 milligrams per liter. Last sentence. India and Pakistan have severe air quality conditions that follow seasonal cycles. Again, let's be specific. The Asian brown cloud often forms from January to March over South Asia from a combination of desert winds and air pollution. I'm going to just now go through these one more time and give you some clues about how to find these in your own documents and other documents that you might be reading. So the question is, does the sentence that you've just read beg a follow-up question? In other words, does it leave more questions than it actually answers? And that will typically be the case for something that is vague or too general or abstract. So in this case, let's look at the first sentence. Because the weather was unsuitable. How unsuitable? Well, freezing rain was damaging our spectrophotometer, so we've answered that question. Next, we observed many species. Which species? That question comes to mind immediately, so that's what we've answered. Next, water concentrations exceeded guidelines. Which guidelines? By a large margin. How much? What does large margin really mean? And finally, India and Pakistan have severe air quality conditions that follow seasonal cycles. So which season? What are those conditions? All of these things can be answered either by correcting that sentence, or it's a little bit longer, but sometimes easier to read. We'll leave these generalities in as a topic sentence and then follow up with multiple sentences to fill in all the details after. I'll end this slide by coming back to the three terms that I defined at the start: concrete, precise, and specific. Remember to always aim at providing concrete, precise, and specific examples, and try and lean towards using that type of language. We can use abstract, vague, and general language, provided that we're using it only as a topic sentence or some other introductory sentence that we'll immediately follow up with to provide all of the details that might be on the mind of the reader. So that's it for Lecture 5B. Have a great week. We'll see you in Lecture 5C.